The British Rail Class 76 and Class 77 locomotives were the two mainline electric locomotive types built for the Manchester, Sheffield, Wath electrification, better remembered as the Woodhead route. These locomotives belonged to Britain's first serious attempt to operate a heavy, mixed-traffic mainline electrically throughout, using 1500-volt DC overhead systems, then regarded as the national standard. The Class 76, originally LNER and British Railways Class EM1, was the hard-working Bobo mixed-traffic locomotive of the scheme, while the Class 77, originally EM2, was its larger Cocoa Express passenger counterpart. Together, they represented a bold but ultimately isolated chapter in British electric traction, technically advanced, strongly associated with coal traffic and Pennine passenger trains, yet made strategically vulnerable almost as soon as they were built by the national move towards 25 kV AC electrification. Their background lay in the London and North Eastern Railway's pre-war plan to modernise the difficult Manchester, Sheffield and Wath line, with this route crossing the Pennines through the Woodhead tunnels and handled heavy east-to-west coal traffic as well as passenger services between Manchester and Sheffield. Steam operation through the tunnels was dirty, arduous and poorly suited to the gradients and ventilation problems of the line, and thus in November 1936, the LNER announced a scheme to electrify the route at 1500 volts DC overhead, a system recommended by the Ministry of Transport in 1927 and already used on the Manchester, South Junction and Altrincham line. The initial plan envisaged 69 mixed-traffic EM1 locomotives, 9 express passenger EM2 locomotives and 10 banking locomotives, showing that from the very outset, the railway expected a traffic pattern dominated by heavy freight, with separate provision for passenger and assisting duties. The EM1 design came first, with tenders being invited at the end of 1937, and in January 1939, electrical equipment for 70 locomotives was ordered from Metropolitan Vickers, with final assembly originally planned at Doncaster. The Second World War unfortunately intervened, and electrification work was halted, with the full locomotive order being reduced in November 1939 to a single prototype, and the wider scheme had to wait until the post-war British Railways era. The prototype, LNER number 6701, was completed at Doncaster Works in 1941 to a design associated with Sir Nigel Gresley, and was a 1500-volt DC Bobo mixed-traffic locomotive, though the absence of the completed Woodhead electrification meant that it could only be tested on the limited sections of the LNER 1500-volt DC route then available. The Class 76's design was unusual and, in some respects, daring, with its two four-wheel bogies being coupled together, and the buffers and draw gear were carried on the bogies rather than on the locomotive body. This arrangement meant that traction and braking forces did not pass through the superstructure, with Metropolitan Vickers having supplied a similar drawbar through bogie practice for the South African railways, and Gresley, impressed by the system after visits connected with the design, adopted it for the EM1. Mechanically, it promised to relieve the body of heavy buffing and drawbar loads, but it also contributed to later criticism of riding quality and adhesion behaviour. Each axle was powered by a Metropolitan Vickers traction motor, rated at around 467 horsepower, driving through 1770 reduction gearing, with the two motors on each bogie being permanently connected in series, receiving 750 volts each from the 1500-volt supply, while the two bogie groups could be controlled in series or parallel. Starting was made with the bogies in series and 15 starting resistances in circuit, with the driver accelerating by notching out resistance, then changing to parallel and notching out again, while field weakening gave additional control, producing a total of 19 notches and 2 main electrical gears. In specification form, the production Class 76 was a compact but heavy electric locomotive, having a Bobo arrangement, standard gauge wheels of 4 foot 2 inch diameter, a length over the buffers of around 50 foot 4 inches, and a weight in service of roughly 87 to 88 tons, depending on variant. The normal continuous output was around 1,300 to 1,360 horsepower, with a 1-hour rating of 1,868 horsepower, a maximum speed of 65 miles an hour, and a starting tractive effort of 45,000 pounds force. It collected current through 2 diamond pantographs from 1500-volt DC overhead line equipment, while the braking equipment included regenerative braking from the outset, with later rheostatic braking added on the EM1s as a safety measure, with train braking being originally provided by vacuum, though some locomotives later received dual or air braking for merry-go-round coal work. 14 locomotives eventually carried Bastion and Allen electric steam generators for passenger heating, although freight rather than passenger work remained their natural field. Number 6701 was officially added to stock in September 1941, by which time the conditions that had produced it had almost disappeared beneath wartime priorities. Early trials included steam-hauled running on the East Coast Main Line between Doncaster and Retford, where an uncomfortable oscillation around 20 miles an hour led to experiments with springing. It then worked electrical trials on the MSJ and A line, including load and regenerative braking tests, but more riding problems emerged around 20 to 25 miles an hour, and the locomotive returned to Doncaster in October 1941. After the war, it reappeared as number 6000, having been renumbered in June 1946, but with the Woodhead route still unfinished and the Netherlands short of locomotives after the war, this engine was loaned to Nederlandse Spoorwegen in 1947. There it accumulated useful mileage, but its riding deteriorated until substantial modifications were made in 1948 to the bogies, springing and bogie coupling. The Dutch gave it the affectionate name of Tommy, referring to British soldiers, and when it returned to Britain in 1952, the name was formally retained, with a plate explaining that it had been so named by Dutch railwaymen during the 1947 to 1952 loan. Authority to build the production EM1s was given in July 1946, but the actual post-nationalisation orders were altered by economic pressure and the revised Woodhead scheme, with 24 at one stage being ordered from Darlington and 57 from Gorton, though the Darlington order was ultimately cancelled. The 57 production locomotives were built between 1950 and 1953 at Gorton Works in Manchester, with electrical equipment supplied by Metropolitan Vickers and fitted at Duncanfield. The production EM1s incorporated lessons from Tommy's Dutch experience, using modified springing and bogie arrangements, and outwardly differed from the prototype in details such as cab door and side window positions. The last 10 were fitted with Timken roller bearing axle boxes rather than plain white metal bearings, and although their design was robust, the bow layout was not without consequences, with weight transfer under starting having the potential to unload the leading axle of each bogie, causing wheel slip and reducing adhesion. A weight transfer switch intended to reduce field current in the leading motors was provided but not wholly effective, while trials in 1952 and 1953 investigated the forces involved, including stresses on bogie centre pins, and forged steel pins replaced hollow steel ones after bending and fracture problems, while operationally, crews also learned that slower notching and limited starting current reduced slipping, even if it meant the starting resistances ran hot. Before the Woodhead electrification was ready, the first production EM1s briefly worked far from their intended home, with the Liverpool Street Sheffield electrification in Essex using the same 1500-volt DC system, and from October 1950, the first completed locomotives were sent to Ilford for running in and tests, including regenerative braking on Brentwood Bank. By June 1951, the Wath area overhead wires had been energised, and the locomotives moved north for crew training and further trials, while full service began on the Wath to Dunford Bridge section in February 1952, before the complete through electrification was available. The new Woodhead tunnel was completed in 1953, and the Manchester-Sheffield Wath line came into virtually full electric operation in September 1954. In everyday service, the Class 76 became inseparable from the Woodhead route, and were officially allocated to Reddish Depot, with locomotives also used from points such as Wath as required, where they worked heavy coal and general freight over the Pennines, often with one locomotive hauling and another banking on the steepest sections. They also handled passenger trains when required, especially after the later withdrawal of the Class 77s, though the Woodhead overhead line made distinctive demands of its own, with the EM1s having 2 pantographs, and although normal practice elsewhere might have favoured using one, Woodhead conditions encouraged the use of both. Ice, soot, atmospheric conditions, and non-auto-tensioned overhead equipment made current collection difficult, and the use of 2 raised pantographs improved reliability, and in places where the overhead wire was high, partly because of the existing steam-era structures such as water columns, the pantographs sometimes had to work at near full extension. The Class 77 emerged from the same scheme, but with a different purpose, with the original 1936 plan having called for express passenger locomotives, though the final EM2 design was not simply the pre-war proposal revived. A Swiss locomotive and machine works design was considered before the war, but the locomotives actually built in 1953 and 1954 were essentially a post-war British Railways development, influenced by the EM1 body style, but stretched and re-engineered as a co-co. 7 EM2s were built, numbered 27000 to 27006, later E27000 to E27006, and they were the first co-co overhead electric locomotives built for use in Britain. Originally, a larger fleet, often described as 27 locomotives in post-war planning, had been contemplated, but by the early 1950s, British Railways was already recognising the advantages of 25 kV AC for new mainline electrification, and the Woodhead's 1500-volt DC system therefore risked becoming an isolated island, and the EM2 order was cut down to 7. The EM2 design corrected some of the EM1's weaknesses, with its 6-wheel bogies being based on those used under the LMS diesel-electric prototypes numbers 10,000 and 10,001, and unlike the EM1, the EM2 did not have bogie-mounted draw gear with the bogies coupled together, with its draw gear and buffers being carried on the body so that haulage forces passed through the locomotive structure in a more usual way. This contributed to a smoother ride, important for express passenger work, and the locomotive had oval buffers, Timken roller bearings, twin pantographs, regenerative braking, air locomotive brakes and vacuum train brakes, and all 7 carried Bastion and Allen electric steam generators for carriage heating as their primary purpose with passenger service. The Class 77 was much more powerful and faster than the Class 76, being 59 feet long, weighing around 102 tons, 10 hundredweight, had 6 Metropolitan Vickers traction motors, and was designed for a 90-mile-an-hour maximum speed. While figures vary as to power output, with the usual British Rail figure giving a power output of around 2,490 horsepower, while detailed EM2 technical accounts give a 1-hour rating of around 2,760 horsepower and a continuous rating of around 2,400 horsepower. Starting tractive effort was again 45,000 pounds force, while electrically, 2 of the 3 motors on each bogie were permanently in series, allowing 3 principal motor groupings, with all 6 in series for starting, 2 parallel groups for intermediate speeds, and 3 parallel groups of 2 for higher speed running. While regenerative braking was fitted, though unlike the EM1s, the EM2s never received rheostatic braking. The entry into service of the EM2s coincided with the final completion of the new electric railway, with numbers 27,000 to 27002 being initially allocated to Wath until Reddish opened in June 1954, while the remaining locomotives were allocated to Reddish from New. Number 27,000 Electra hauled the inaugural passenger electric train through the new Woodhead tunnel in September 1954, and public passenger services followed shortly afterwards. The EM2s worked the prestige Manchester-London Road, later Manchester-Piccadilly, to Sheffield Victoria passenger trains, being handsome modern machines delivered in black and later repainted into BR green, with at least one receiving the electric blue livery associated with the early AC locomotives. Between 1959 and 1960, all 7 received names from classical mythology, including Electra, Ariadne, Aurora, Diana, Juno, Minerva and Pandora. The later named EM1s followed a similar Greek theme, with names such as Archimedes, Hector, Jason, Mentor, Nestor, Perseus, Prometheus, Triton and Ulysses, while the prototype EM1 retained the name of Tommy. Despite the EM2's superior ride and high-speed ability, the Woodhead route did not give it the sort of work that would fully justify a fleet of dedicated express locomotives, with the Manchester to Sheffield line being short, heavily graded, freight-dominated, and subject to speeds that eroded the practical advantage of a 90-mile-an-hour locomotive. By 1960, the line speed had reportedly fallen from 65 miles an hour to 60 over the route, and in that context the EM2's superiority over the EM1 on passenger work looked less decisive. While the EM2 could perform well, including sustained running with heavy passenger formations on rising gradients, it was a small, non-standard class on a non-standard electrification system, while also being less suitable than the EM1 for heavy freight work, as although a CoCo could theoretically improve adhesion, the absence of EM1-style weight transfer switches and the design's passenger orientation meant that the EM2s could still suffer slipping when used on goods trains. The Class 76 took on an enlarged passenger role when the Class 77s were withdrawn in 1968, with the EM2s being taken out of regular service in March of that year, and officially withdrawn by the end of 1968, just as the TOPS classification system designated them Class 77. Their passenger work continued briefly behind Class 76s until the Woodhead passenger service ended in January 1970, with the Class 76s with steam heating boilers, including several of the Greek-named locomotives, losing much of their passenger purpose, while the prototype Tommy was withdrawn in March 1970 and scrapped at Crewe in 1972. The late career of the Class 76 was dominated by coal, as from January 1970, merry-go-round coal trains from the South Yorkshire coalfield to Fiddler's Ferry power station near Widnes became central to the route. These workings typically used 2 Class 76s at the head of a train, with 2 more banking over the severe Worsborough incline between Womwell and Silkstone. To make this possible, 30 Class 76s were modified from the late 1960s and through the 1970s for multiple unit control, air braking, and communication between leading and banking locomotives, with a clear call intercom system allowing crews at the front and rear to communicate through the overhead line equipment, while west of Manchester, the same trains were generally diesel-hauled, again underlining how the Woodhead Electrics were bounded by their isolated DC territory. The Class 76 fleet changed appearance and identity over time, with the locomotives being delivered in black with red lining, while number 26020 was specially finished with stainless steel handrails and cab window surrounds for the 1951 Festival of Britain. From the late 1950s, Brunswick Green became standard, later with small-style yellow warning panels, and from the late 1960s, BR Blue with full yellow ends appeared. The numbering also evolved, with the prototype and production machines running as 26,000 to 26057, later with an E prefix, and then as Class 76 under tops, with most surviving locomotives being renumbered to 76001 to 76057 from 1971 onwards, while some further renumbering in 1976 grouped air-braked examples into a more logical block, creating a complicated identity trail for individual locomotives. The Class 77s, by contrast, found a second and in some ways more successful life abroad, with September 1969 seeing all 7 engines being sold to Nederlandse Spoorwegen, becoming the NS Class 1500. One example, E27005 Minerva, was broken up for spares, but the remaining 6 were modified, including new headlight arrangements, and entered Dutch service in 1970 and 1971. These engines retained their names and worked principally on express services such as The Hague to the German border at Venlo, as well as on occasional freight traffic. Their Dutch mileage was impressive, with class leader Electra alone having accumulated 5 million miles in Holland by the time it was handed over for preservation in July 1986. The end of the Class 76 came with the end of the Woodhead route as an electrified through railway, as with passenger services over the route having finished in January 1970, freight would keep the wires alive for another decade. However, by the late 1970s, the locomotives were old but still generally regarded as robust and effective, and many were still serviceable, though the difficulty was that the line's freight traffic was declining, the 1500-volt DC equipment was non-standard, and conversion to 25 kV AC would require heavy investment in infrastructure, signalling, and new or converted traction. Closure of the line was announced in 1980, and the final scheduled freight trains ran overnight on July 17th and 18th, 1981. With 76006 and 76014 hauling the final freight workings. Scrapping followed during the early 1980s, with some withdrawn locomotives having already been stored at Reddish, Guide Bridge and other locations, with several bogieless grounded bodies having been noted at Reddish since as early as the late 1970s. In terms of preservation, only one complete Class 76 survives, number 26020, later 76020, which is now part of the National Collection. This engine having been built at Gorton Works in 1951 and was displayed at the Festival of Britain from February to November of that year before being withdrawn in 1977 and was chosen for preservation partly because of its festival role and partly because it hauled the train at the opening of the Woodhead Tunnel. Parts of other Class 76s also survive, including the cab of 76039 Hector and materials from 76051 Mentor. The Class 77s fared better in preservation due to their Dutch afterlife, with 3 locomotives surviving, including class leader number 27000 Electra, which returned to Britain and is preserved at the Midland Railway, Butterley, while 27001 Ariadne, which became NS 1505, is preserved by the Science Museum Group in Manchester, and 27003 Diana survives in the Netherlands. Electra and Ariadne had the distinction of hauling the 1986 EM2 farewell tour in the Netherlands, before both locomotives returned by ferry to Britain in July of the same year, with Electra being cosmetically restored into BR condition. Ultimately, the Class 76 and Class 77 tell a story of ambition, technical skill and strategic misfortune, with the EM1s being unglamorous but indispensable machines for the Woodhead electrification, powerful for its size, rugged, regenerative, adaptable and capable of hard coal traffic over severe gradients, though its flaws, especially weight transfer, slipping and indifferent high-speed riding, were very real, though crews and engineers learned how to manage them, and the class gave nearly 3 decades of intensive service. The EM2 was the more elegant and advanced passenger locomotive, being smoother, faster and more powerful, but its small fleet and isolated electrical system doomed its career in Britain, though ironically, the EM2s proved their worth after export, outliving the Woodhead route and achieving long productive Dutch careers. Their combined legacy is larger than their numbers suggest, being the visible symbol of Britain's first all-electric mainline railway, a route where post-war modernity briefly ran at 1500 volts across the Pennines before policy, economics and changing standards brought the experiment to an end.